The village of Brightwaga, nestled in the arid hills of Castile, had known hardship before droughts, plagues, and the ever-present shadow of the Inquisition had shaped its people into wary survivors. But in the summer of 1674, when Eugenia Martínez Vallejo was born, the whispers began a new knot of divine wrath. But if something faster danger from the moment she drew her first breath, Eugenia was different. Her cries were louder, her limbs thicker, her hunger insatiable. By her first year, she had outgrown the cradle, her round cheeks and swollen limbs straining against the linen swaddling. Her mother, Maria, wept as she struggled to lift her, her back aching from the weight of her own child. The midwife, an old woman with sunken eyes, crossed herself and muttered of curses. "Such a child is not natural," the villagers murmured at the well, the voices hushed, but sharp. God would not make one so. Eugenia grew, and with her the rumors. Some claimed her appetite was demonic, but she devoured twice her weight in bread and milk each day. Others whispered she was a punishment, a living testament to some hidden sin of her parents. The priest, Father Alonso, eyed her with wary fascination as if she were a theological puzzle he dared not solve. Her father, a stooped farmer named Thomas, bore the shame silently. He had hoped for a son to till the rocky soil, not a daughter whose very body seemed to define nature. Yet when he looked into Eugenia's wide, dark eyes, so full of innocent confusion, his heart twisted. She was his child, cursed or not. The other children avoided her. They called her the monster and threw stones. When she waddled near, Eugenia learned early to stay close to the hearth, where her mother's tired hands would stroke her hair and murmur half-hearted comforts. "God made you as you are," Maria would say, though her voice wavered. But God's design, it seemed, was a cruel one. By the age of 6, Eugenia could barely walk without gasping for breath. Her skin stretched taut over her swollen frame, marked by angry red folds, where the weight pressed too hard. The village physician, a man of little skill and less compassion, declared her a medical oddity, a thing to be studied, not healed. And so Eugenie, his world narrowed to the walls of that cramped cottage where the firelight flickered over her rounded silhouette, casting a monstrous shadow on the wall. Beyond those walls, the whispers grew louder, carried on the dry Castilian wind until they reached as far more powerful than those of superstitious peasants. The court of Charles II would soon hear of the girl who defied nature, and that curiosity would change her life forever. The letter arrived on a day when the wind carried the scent of burnt wheat from the fields. A horseman in livery, his doublet embroidered with the royal crest, dismounted outside the Martínez Vallejo cottage. The villagers gathered in silent clusters, their eyes wide, with a mixture of awe and dread. Tomás wiped his hands on his tunic, streaked with dirt from the fields, as he stepped forward to take the parchment. His fingers trembled as he broke the wax seal, a mark he had only seen in church on the missives of bishops. The words penned in flowing script were read aloud by the village scribe, his voice cracking under the weight of their meaning. By order of His Most Catholic Majesty, Charles, the second King of Spain, the child known as Eugenia Martínez Vallejo is summoned to the royal court of Madrid there, to be presented before the nobility for examination and amusement. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Maria clutched Eugenia to her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "No," she whispered, but the horseman's expression was implacable. "The king's will is not to be questioned," he said, his voice clipped. "The child is a wonder, a marvel of God's creation. His Majesty wishes to behold her." Eugenia, her round face flushed with confusion, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, what do they want?" Maria could not answer. Her throat had closed around the words. The preparations were swift and brutal. The carriage arrived 2 days later, its velvet curtains drawn against prying eyes. The villagers watched as Eugenia was dressed in the finest clothes. The local seamstress could hastily stitch a gown of rough spun wool, dyed a faded blue, straining at the seams. Her hair, usually left loose, was pinned beneath a linen cap. "Be brave," Thomas told her, his voice thick. He pressed a small wooden cross into her palm. "God goes with you, Eugenia." His lower lip trembled, but she nodded. She did not understand why she was being taken, only that her parents' faces were streaked with tears. The journey to Madrid was a blur of dust and jolting wheels. The carriage, though grand by village standards, was stifling Eugenie as body ached from the constant motion, her skin chafing against the unfamiliar fabric. The horseman. A man named Don Alvaro barely spoke to her except to bark orders. "Stay still," he snapped when she shifted uncomfortably. "You are to be presented as a curiosity, not a squalling peasant." At night they stopped at inns where Eugenia was hidden away in back rooms, lest travelers glimpse the king's prize before its unveiling. She ate alone, her meals brought by silent servants who averted their eyes. Once she overheard two maids whispering, "They say she weighs as much as a grown ox." Poor creature, do you think she knows what they'll do to her? Eugenia did not sleep that night when the spires of Madrid finally pierced the horizon. Her stomach twisted. The city was a roaring beast of noise and stench. So unlike the quiet hills of Braga, the carriage rolled through gates, adorned with golden crests, past guards and polished breastplates into a world of marble and gilt as the carriage halted in a sunlit courtyard. Don Alvaro yanked open the door out. He commanded. "And remember, you are here to be seen, not heard." Eugenia stepped down, her legs unsteady around her courtiers in silks and jewels. Paused mid-conversation, their eyes locking onto her with a hunger that made her skin crawl. A man in a powdered wig leaned toward his companion, fan fluttering. "So this is the monstrous child." How delightfully grotesque. Eugenia's fingers tightened around the cross in her palm. Somewhere beyond the towering doors the king awaited. And with him, a fate she could not yet fathom. The grand hall of the Alcazar was a blur of candlelight and murmurs. Eugenia stood frozen at the center of the polished floor, her bare feet sinking slightly into the plush carpet. The air smelled of beeswax and rosewater so thick it made her head swim around her. The nobility of Spain had gathered in a glittering semicircle, the silks rustling like the wings of restless birds. A woman in a towering lace headdress tittered behind her fan. "Look at the size of her, like a barrel with legs." Eugenie, his face burned, but she kept her eyes fixed on the ground. The cross in her palm dug into her skin, a small, sharp reminder of home at the far end of the hall. Beneath a canopy of crimson velvet sat King Charles II. His face was pale and elongated, his lower jaw jutting slightly. A legacy of generations of royal inbreeding. His dark eyes, though dulled by illness, gleamed with something like fascination as he gestured for her to come closer. "Bring her forth," he commanded, his voice thin, but carrying Don over nudged Eugenia forward with the tip of his boot. She stumbled, her breath itching as laughter rippled through the crowd. "Careful, or sure, crack the tiles," a nobleman called out, earning a chorus of snickers. The king ignored them, leaning forward in his gilded chair. "Turn," he ordered. Eugenia hesitated, unsure. "Turn," Don Alvaro hissed, seizing her shoulder and spinning her roughly. The room erupted in gasps and delighted exclamations. Marvelous. A bishop in embroidered robes clapped his hands. Such abundance must be a sign of divine favor or perhaps divine jest. Eugenie, his vision blurred. She could feel their stares like hot brands against her skin, tracing the swell of her belly, the thickness of her arms. A man in a feathered hat sketched her hastily on a scrap of parchment, exaggerating her proportions until she resembled a grotesque caricature. "Can she dance?" a duchess asked, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. Before Eugenia could react, a fiddler struck up a lively tune. The nobles clapped in rhythm, their smiles sharp. "Go on, then. Show us how a peasant girl celebrates." Tears pricked Eugenia his eyes, but she forced her legs to move. She swayed awkwardly, her arms flailing as she struggled to keep balance. The laughter grew louder, a cacophony of cruel delight. Someone threw a sugar almond. It bounced off her cheek and rolled across the floor. Enough. The command came not from the king, but from a slender woman at his side, Queen Mariana, her face lined with weariness. For a moment the hall fell silent. "But child," the second wave to dismissive hand nonsense. "The girl amuses me." He turned to a servant of her fed. "I wish to see how much she can consume." A table was brought forth laden with roasted meats, sweetmeats, and flagon of wine. The nobles pressed closer, their eyes alight with anticipation. "Eat," the king said, as if issuing a challenge. Eugenia's stomach twisted at home. Hunger had been a constant companion gnawing at her, even as her body swelled. But here the food was a weapon. Another spectacle for that entertainment. She reached for a loaf of bread, her fingers trembling. The moment she bit into it, the room erupted in cheers. Like a pig at trough, a courtier crowed. Eugenia chewed mechanically, the bread turning to ash in her mouth. The queen's gaze met hers briefly. a flicker of something like pity before she looked away. When the platters were emptied, the king yawned. "Take her away, we will have her again tomorrow as gods." "Let her from the hall," the whispers followed. "Did you see how she gorged a creature of pure appetite? How exquisite, Eugenie." His fingers tightened around the cross until it drew blood. That night in the tiny chamber, they had given her more a cell than a room. She pressed her face into the straw mattress and wept outside. The moon cast silver light over the palace walls. Somewhere in the labyrinth of corridors, a painter sharpened his quill, eager to capture the king's new favorite oddity. And so began Eugenie, his life as a spectacle. The days blurred into a grotesque parade of humiliation. Eugenia was no longer a girl. She was a thing to be displayed, a marvel to be dissected with laughter and jeers. The court's initial curiosity had hardened into something darker, a relentless hunger for spectacle that demanded ever more elaborate performances. On the third morning, a servant arrived with a bundle of silk and lace. "You are to wear this," he said, tossing the garments onto the narrow cot. Eugenia unfolded the dress, a mockery of court fashion. It seemed straining even before she attempted to put it on. The fabric was too tight, the bodice laced so cruelly that her breath came in. Shallow gasps when she emerged. The waiting nobles erupted in laughter. "Look at her. A sow in satin." The king, reclining on his throne, smirked. "Now dance for us again, Monstera." This time they had prepared a stage. A wooden platform had been erected in the center of the hall, its surface polished to a treacherous shine. Eugenia climbed the steps with effort, her legs trembling. The fiddler struck up a frenzied tune and the nobles clapped in time, their eyes gleaming with malice. She moved as best she could, her body swaying under its own weight. The laughter grew louder, more insistent. Someone threw a handful of rose petals. They stuck to her sweat-slicked skin like grotesque adornments. Faster. A voice called Eugenie as foot slipped. She crushed to the stage with a thud that shook the platform. Pain shot through her knees. But the court's laughter drowned out her gasp. "Oh, bravo. A perfect finish." Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she pushed herself up her fingers, digging into the wood. The king was watching her, his lips curled in amusement. "Again," he said, and so it went. By week's end, the demands grew more inventive. They dressed her in armor too small for her frame and declared her the great fat knight. Poking her with canes as she lumbered across the hall, they had her balance on a stool while jesters pretended to knock her off, sending the court into fits of laughter. Each time she wobbled. One evening they brought in a scale, a monstrous thing of iron and chains. "Let us see what the king's marvel weighs," a duke proclaimed. Eugenia stepped onto the platform, her face burning as the needles swung wildly. The courtiers gasped and exaggerated. "All 400 pounds if it's an ounce. A true titan of flesh." The queen, silent as ever, turned away. The worst came on the feast day of St. John. The palace was alive with torches and music, the air thick with the scent of roasting meat. Eugenia was led not to the hall, but to the gardens where a great fountain had been drained. "Tonight, the king announced a monster shall bathe for us." A murmur of delight rippled through the crowd. Eugenia's stomach lurched. The servants had filled the fountain's basin with wine. A ridiculous extravagance. A river of crimson liquid shimmering under the torchlight. "Go on," a countess urged, her voice sickly sweet. "Surely you've never tasted such vintage?" Eugenia hesitated. The cross was gone now, lost somewhere in the chaos of her days. She had nothing to hold on to but her own ragged breath. The king's patience frayed. "Must I command you twice?" Hands grabbed her, pushing her toward the basin. The wine lapped at her feet, cold and slick. She stumbled forward, the liquid rising to her waist as the court cheered. "Drink. Let's see if she floats." Eugenia closed her eyes and let the laughter wash over her. The wine stained her skin, her dress, her hair. It filled her nose, her mouth, bitter and suffocating. When they finally pulled her out, dripping and shivering, the king applauded, magnificent. That night, back in her cell, Eugenia scrubbed her skin until it was raw. The scent of wine clung to her, a cruel reminder. Outside the festivities continued, the nobles' voices rising in drunken song. She pressed her forehead against the cold stone wall somewhere far beyond these gilded halls. Her parents might still be whispering her name, but here she was. No one here. She was only the spectacle. The summons came at dawn, delivered by a page boy with ink-stained fingers. Eugenia barely stood as he rattled the iron latch of her chamber door up Monstera. He sneered, tossing a scrap of parchment onto the straw. "The king has commanded your presence in the portrait gallery." Eugenia blinked against the pale morning light. Her body ached from the previous night's humiliation. The wine had dried sticky on her skin, and her knees were still raw from the stage. But refusal was not an option. The gallery was a long vaulted hall, lined with the faces of kings and queens. The oil-painted eyes following her as she shuffled forward. At the far end, beneath a canopy of velvet drapes, stood a wiry man in a paint-splattered doublet. His fingers drummed impatiently against his easel. "Ah, the subject arrives," he said, his voice sharp with disdain. "I am Don Sebastian de Herrera, court painter to His Majesty. You will sit as I command." Eugenia hesitated. "I do not understand." A noble woman nearby fanned herself with a titter. "Oh, how droll! The creature thinks she has a choice." Don Sebastian gestured to a raised platform. Its surface draped in heavy brocade. "Climb and do not move once you are in position." The platform groaned under Eugenia, his weight as she settled onto it. The painter circled her like a vulture, his gaze dissecting her from every angle. "Turn your face to the light," he ordered. "No. Chin up. Let them see the fullness of your." Eugenia obeyed, her hands clenched in her lap. The nobles had begun to gather, whispering behind the gloves. Will he paint her as she is, or as she feels a market mused as she is? "Would be horror enough," his companion replied. Don Sebastian dipped his brush into a swirl of ochre and began. The bristles scraped against the canvas in quick, ruthless strokes. He did not paint her as a person. No, she was a study, a grotesque marvel to be immortalized for the amusement of future generations. "Hold still," he snapped when she shifted. "Unless you wish to be remembered as a blur of indecency." The session stretched for hours. Eugenia's back stiffened, her breath growing shallow under the weight of scrutiny. The painter's eyes flicked between her and the canvas, his mouth twisting in dissatisfaction. "More," he muttered, "more of the folds." The bulk let them see the absurdity of God's handiwork. A servant brought a platter of fruit, and the nobles nibbled as they watched, their laughter muffled behind silk sleeves. "Will he include the way her dress strains at the seams?" a duchess asked. "Of course," Don Sebastian replied, without looking up every glorious imperfection. "Eugenia is vision blurred?" She focused on a crack in the far wall, letting her mind drift far from this gilded prison. She thought of bright Wagga, of the dry wind through the olive trees, of her mother's voice humming by the fire. A sharp clap shattered the illusion. "Enough for today," the painter declared, wiping his hands on a rag. "Tomorrow we shall capture the magnificence of her profile." As Eugenia stepped down, her legs numb. A page boy darted forward with a smirk. "The king wishes to see the progress done." Sebastian turned the canvas toward the gathered courtiers. A gasp rippled through the crowd. There she was, Eugenia Martínez, video rendered in cruel, unflinching detail. Her body ballooned grotesquely on the canvas, her face a mask of vacant suffering. The painter had exaggerated every curve, every crease, until she resembled less a girl and more a monstrous caricature of excess. "Exquisite," the king murmured, his fingers tracing the edge of the frame. A true masterpiece of the bizarre. Eugenie, his throat tightened. This was to be her legacy, not a life, not a story, but a joke in oils, a spectacle frozen in time. As the courtiers applauded, she turned away. Her reflection walked in a gilded mirror on the wall. The girl, staring back, was unrecognizable, a distorted shadow, a thing of pity and ridicule. And the worst part? The painting was only half finished. The days of posing bled together like wet paint left in the sun. Each morning, Eugenia was dragged back to the gallery, forced to hold still for hours as Don Sebastian's brush scraped across the canvas. The painter's hands moved with cold precision, capturing every unflattering angle, every fold of flesh, every shadow of her humiliation. "Tilt your head, no down," he snapped one afternoon, gesturing sharply. "Let the light catch your jowls." Eugenia obeyed, her neck stiff from hours of unnatural poses. The nobles had taken to bringing their guests to watch as if her suffering were a newly discovered entertainment. Remarkable moment of visiting diplomat, his beady eyes fixed on her. "I've heard of giants and dwarfs. But this is something else entirely." Don Sebastian smirked, a triumph of nature's absurdity. Eugenia has fingers dug into the brocade beneath her. She had learned to retreat into herself, to let her mind wander far from the gallery's stifling air. But today, something sharp and aching pulled her back to the present. The little girl stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching her mother's skirts. She couldn't have been more than 5. Eugenia's age when the village children first called her La Monster. The girl's eyes were wide, not with laughter, but with something like fear. "Mama," the child whispered too loud. "Is she going to eat me?" The crowd tittered. Eugenia's breath hitched. The mother patted her daughter's head. "No, Carino. She's just a curiosity, a thing to look at." A thing. The words settled into Eugenia as bones like ice. That night she lay awake in her cell, staring at the ceiling. The faint scent of linseed oil still clung to her skin, a bitter reminder of the day's work. Outside the palace was silent, except for the occasional footsteps of guards on their rounds. She rolled onto her side, wincing as the straw mattress crunched beneath her. In the darkness, she could almost pretend she was back in Brainwave, in the little cot by the hearth. But the illusion shattered when her hand brushed against her own body. The swell of her stomach, the thickness of her arms, this is who I am now. The thought was a knife twisting in her ribs. The next morning, the final sitting began. Don Sebastian worked feverishly, his brush darting across the canvas, as if afraid the grotesquerie before him might vanish. Almost done, he muttered more to himself than to her. Just the eyes, the soul of the piece. Eugenia blinked. So did he think she had won? The painter leaned in his gaze, critical. "Look at me." "No, not like a frightened cow, like you know what you are." She swallowed. "And what am I?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. The gallery fell silent. Even the nobles paused in their chatter, waiting for the answer. Don Sebastian's lip curled. "You are a wonder of nature. A just of God, a thing to be marveled at and forgotten." He dabbed his brush in a pool of black paint. "Now hold still." Eugenia stared straight ahead, her eyes dry and burning. The brush flicked across the canvas one last time, fetching her sorrow into permanence. When it was over, the painter stepped back, wiping his hands with a satisfied sigh. Finished. The courtiers crowded around, their murmurs rising to a crescendo. Astounding. She looks even more ridiculous, captured in oils. The king himself approached his pale fingers, tracing the frame. "Hang it in the Hall of Curiosities," he commanded. "Let all who visit know the glory of Spain's marvels." Eugenia stepped down from the platform, her legs numb. No one looked at her now. Their eyes were fixed on the painting, on the monstrous image that would outlive her. She caught a glimpse of it as she was led away. There she was. Eugenia Martínez Vallejo, immortalized not as a girl, but as a spectacle. Her body was a grotesque mountain of flesh, her face a hollow mask. Only the eyes held any semblance of life, dark and wounded, screaming silently from the canvas. A servant shoved her toward the door. "Move along, Monstera. Your use is done," as she stumbled into the corridor. The chairs of the court followed her, echoing off the stone walls. Somewhere in the depths of the palace, a painter washed his brushes. His masterpiece, complete. And somewhere deep inside herself, Eugenia felt the last flicker of hope got her out. She would never be remembered as a person, only as a joke. The banquet hall shimmered under the glow of 1,000 candles, the light reflecting off gilded mirrors and jeweled goblets. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, spiced wine, and the cloying sweetness of marzipan. Nobles in brocade and silk laughed behind lace fans, their voices a symphony of calculated mirth. Eugenia stood at the edge of the room, her body encased in a gown that was both too tight and too lavish, a cruel joke stitched in velvet and pearls. The fabric dug into her flesh. The bodies laced so tightly she could barely breathe. A servant had spent hours dressing her, tugging and pinning with cold efficiency, as if she were a mannequin rather than a living girl. "There," the woman had said, stepping back with a smirk. "Now you look like a proper lady." The words had tasted like ash. A fan tapped against her shoulder. "My dear, you are quite the vision." Tonight, Eugenia turned to see the Duchess of Alba, her powdered face arranged in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, Your Grace." Eugenia murmured, the words automatic. The Duchess's gaze raked over her, lingering on the way the fabric strained at her hips. "Tell me, do they feed you extra for these occasions? Or does the court simply enjoy watching you burst from your seams?" A nearby baroness tittered. Perhaps we should place bets on which stitch will give way first. Eugenia's fingers curled into her palms, the bite of her nails. A grounding pain she had learned by now that silence was her only shield. The king, seated at the high table, raised a hand. Let the entertainment begin. A hush fell over the crowd as servants pushed forward a massive scale, its brass plates gleaming. Eugenie, a stomach lurched. They had done this before. Wait, her like livestock? At a fair while, the court gasped and jeered. Come, monster. Charles II called, his voice dripping with false warmth. Let us see if the royal kitchens have fattened you further. The nobles parted. As Eugenia walked forward, her step slow and heavy. The scale creaked ominously as she stepped onto it, the needle swinging wildly before settling for 420 pounds. A herald announced the hall erupted in exaggerated gasps. The astonishing she's grown since last month like a mushroom after rain, a count leaned in his breath, reeking of wine. Tell me, do you feel your own weight when you walk? Or is it like carrying a kingdom? Eugenia stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched. The king waved a hand. Enough. Let us feast. The banquet began in earnest platters of suckling, pig, and sugared fruits circulating among the guests. Eugenia was led to a specially reinforced chair at a table of her own, a grotesque throne where she could be observed as she ate. Go on, a marquis urged, nudging a platter of pastries to her indulge. The nobles watched, rapt as she picked up a tart. The moment she took a bite, they burst into applause, as if she had performed some great feat. Marvelous. She eats like a queen of gluttony, perhaps. Eugenia chewed mechanically, the honeyed fillings sickly sweet on her tongue. The laughter swirled around her, a tempest of cruelty. Then a new voice cut through the noise. Your Majesty. The crowd turned as one a young nobleman knew too, caught by the unfamiliar cut of his doublet, bowed deeply. Might I propose a toast, Charles? The second nodded indulgently. Speak. The nobleman raised his goblet, his eyes locking onto Eugenie as to the greatest wonder of Spain. The creature so vast, so magnificent that she puts our finest statues to shame. The court roared with approval. Goblets clinking, Eugenie, his face burned. But the nobleman wasn't done. And to think, he continued grinning. She was once a mere peasant. Now she dines with kings. What fortune? The word fortune dripped with mockery. Eugenie, whose hands trembled in her lap. The queen, silent for most of the evening, set down her fork with a quiet clink. Enough, she said, her voice barely audible. But the king only laughed. Let them enjoy themselves, my dear. The girl is here for their amusement, is she not? A servant leaned over Eugenia's shoulder, refilling her wine glass to the brim. Drink, he muttered. It'll make the night easier. She lifted the glass, the ruby liquid, trembling around her. The nobles had moved on to other diversions. A jester tumbled across the floor. A poet recited verses laced with innuendo, but their eyes kept flicking back to her, hungry for the next spectacle. As the night wore on, the wine flowed freely and the jests grew older. I heard she was born from a cow and a mountain. No, she's the lost daughter of Gargantua, Eugenie. His vision blurred. The candles seemed to multiply their flames, dancing in mocking mimicry of the revelry. Then a hand clamped onto her arm up. Don Alvaro hissed. The king wishes you to dance. The musicians struck up a lively Galahad. The nobles formed a circle, their faces alight with anticipation. Eugenia stood, her legs unsteady, though on a duchess urged her smile sharp. Show us how a lady moves. The first step was agony, the second humiliation by the third. The room was spinning, the laughter, a deafening roar in her ears. She stumbled, her foot catching on the hem of her too-tight gown. The fall was slow, inevitable. The impact shook the floor for a heartbeat. Silence then. Delighted. Shrieks. Oh, perfect. Did you see her roll, Eugenia? Lay there. The cold stone pressing into her cheek as the nobles applauded her failure. The queen had turned away, her face hidden behind her fan. The king was laughing so hard he had to wipe his eyes as servants helped her up their grips, bruising their voices thick with disdain. Eugenia caught her reflection in a polished platter. A monstrous figure stared back, her finery in disarray. Her face flushed with shame. The nobles saw a joke. But in that moment, Eugenia saw something else. Something far worse. She saw herself through their eyes. The laughter of the court still echoed in Eugenie as she was led back to her chamber. her body aching from the fall. The servant who escorted her did not bother to hide his smirk, his fingers digging into her arm as if she were a beast to be corralled. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, Eugenia sagged against the wall, her breath coming in, ragged gasps. The gown already too tight felt like a prison of its own. With trembling fingers, she clawed at the laces, desperate for relief. The fabric gave way with a groan, and she let the dress pool at her feet like a discarded skin. For a long moment she stood there in the dim light, her body bare and trembling. The cold stone beneath her feet was a stark contrast to the feverish heat of the banquet hall. No more. The thought struck her like a lightning bolt. She had endured that years. The humiliations, the endless demands, but this was too much. She would not break, not completely. The rebellion began in small, silent acts. The next morning, when the servants brought her breakfast, a platter piled high with bread, cheese, and honeyed figs meant to fatten her further for the court's amusement, Eugenia did not touch it. She let it sit on the table until the bread grew stale and the cheese hardened. The servant who came to collect the tray frowned. "You didn't eat?" Eugenia said nothing. When the same thing happened the next day, the servant's frown deepened. By the third day, the portions grew larger, the dishes richer, as if to tempt her into submission. Still, Eugenia turned away. "The king won't be pleased." The servant warned Eugenia met his gaze for the first time. "Let him be displeased." The words were quiet, but they sent a ripple through the room. The servant's eyes widened, as if he had never considered that the monster might have a will of her own. The defiance spread when Don Sebastian summoned her for another sitting, this time to paint her alongside a dwarf and a bearded lady, a grotesque triptych of nature's marvels. Eugenia refused to climb the platform. "I will not sit for you," she said, her voice steady. The painter's face darkened. "You will, or the king will hear of it." Eugenia crossed her arms, then let him hear. The nobles gasped. No one had ever denied the king's whims before. Don Sebastian's hand twitched toward his belt, where a thin switch hung. "You ungrateful creature! Do you know what they do to disobedient peasants?" Eugenia did not flinch. "Do it. Beat me. But I will not move." A tense silence filled the gallery. The painter's fingers tightened around the switch. But then, to everyone's surprise, he lowered it. "Fine," he spat. "But this defiance will cost you." The cost came swiftly. That evening, her usual meal was replaced with a single crust of bread and a cup of water. The servant who delivered it smirked. "The king says, if you refuse to eat like a lady, you'll eat like a beggar." Eugenia took the bread without a word. It was dry and tasteless, but it was hers. The next test came during a royal procession through the palace gardens. The king, in a capricious mood, ordered Eugenia to walk beside his carriage, a living testament to his power over even the most unnatural of creatures. The courtiers tittered as she struggled to keep pace. Her breath labored under the summer sun. Halfway through, the king leaned out, his eyes gleaming. "Kiss the ground, monster. Show your gratitude." Eugenia stopped walking. The carriage rolled forward a few paces before the king realized she was no longer following. He turned his face flushing with anger. "Did you not hear me?" Eugenia lifted her chin. I heard a murmur ran through the crowd. The queen, seated beside Charles, touched his arm. "Let it go," she moaned, but the king's pride was stung. "You will kneel?" he hissed. Eugenia held his gaze. Then slowly, she bent not to kiss the earth, but to pluck a single wildflower from the grass. She straightened, twirling the delicate stem between her fingers. The king's face, twisted gods to mend, seized her arms. But Eugenia did not struggle. She let the flower fall from her hand, its petals scattering in the breeze. That night, locked in her chamber, she pressed her ear to the door and listened to the gods, muttering outside. "The king is furious," one said. "What did he expect?" the other replied. "Even a beast knows when it's been pushed too far." Eugenia smiled in the dark. The rebellion was small, it was silent, but it was hers. And for the first time in years, she felt something stir inside her, something that had long been buried under layers of shame and submission. It was the faint, fragile spark of defiance, and she would find it into a flame. The years passed like shadows creeping across the palace walls. Slow, silent, and indifferent. The court's fascination with Eugenia waned, as all novelties do. The nobles found new distractions. A two-headed calf from the countryside, a fiery two from the Orient. A pair of conjoined twins who sang in perfect harmony. Eugenia, once the star of their cruel spectacles, was relegated to the edges of memory. She was given a small, drafty room in the servants' quarters, far from the gilded halls where she had once been paraded. The walls were damp, the straw mattress thin and crawling with lice. No one bothered to dress her in fine silks anymore. She wore simple, shapeless shifts that hung loosely on her frame. The feasts had stopped to her. Meals were meager gruel, stale bread, the occasional scrap of meat, just enough to keep her alive, but never enough to satisfy the hunger that had defined her existence. Sometimes in the dead of night she pressed her hands to her belly and marveled at how much smaller she had become. The folds of flesh that had once made her a spectacle had softened, sagged. She was still large, still other, but no longer the monstrous caricature the court had adored. No one came to see her, no one that is except the rats. They skittered across the floor at night, the tiny claws clicking against the stone. Eugenia didn't mind them. They were better company than the nobles. Quieter at least, and far kinder. One evening, as she picked at a crust of bread, a young scullery maid slipped into her room. The girl couldn't have been more than 12, her apron streaked with soot, her cheeks flushed from the heat of the kitchens. "Here," she whispered, pressing a wedge of cheese into his hand. Cook didn't notice it was missing. Eugenia stared at the offering, her throat tight. "Why?" the girl shrugged. "You looked hungry." It was the first kindness Eugenia had been shown in years. She ate the cheese, slowly savoring each bite while girl lingered in the doorway. "Did you really used to dance for the king?" the maid asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Eugenie, his fingers stilled. "I did. Was it grand?" A bitter laugh escaped her. "No, it was not grand." The girl frowned, as if trying to reconcile the haggard woman before her with the story she'd heard. "They say you could eat a whole pig in one sitting." Eugenia set the last bit of cheese aside. "They say a lot of things." A bell rang in the distance. The summons for evening prayers. The girl jumped. "I have to go." She hesitated. "I can bring more tomorrow if you like." Eugenia nodded, though she doubted the girl would return. Promises were easily made and just as easily broken in the palace. But to her surprise, the maid did come back, and the next day, and the day after that, she brought scraps of food, bits of gossip. Once even a stolen ribbon that she tied around Eugenie as wrist. Like a prize. "They've forgotten about you?" the girl confided one afternoon. "The king doesn't even say your name anymore." Eugenia traced the edge of her wooden bowl. "Good. Don't you want to be remembered?" She looked up, meeting the girl's earnest gaze. "Not like that." The maid fell silent, chewing her lip. Then, hesitantly, she asked, "What do you want to be remembered for?" Eugenia had no answer. The seasons turned. The scullery maid grew taller. Her visits less frequent. Eventually, they stopped altogether. Eugenia didn't blame her. The girl had her own life to live. Her own struggles to face alone again. Eugenia took to sitting by the narrow slit of a window in her room, watching the world outside. She saw servants hurrying across the courtyard, nobles riding out to hunt, the occasional traveler arriving with news from distant lands. Life went on as it always did without her. One day, a new painting appeared in the Hall of Curiosities, a portrait of a lion, its mane wild and golden, its teeth bared in a snarl. The court oothed and argued over it, marveling at the artist's skill. No one glanced at the other paintings lining the walls. Least all the one tucked in the darkest corner. A grotesque, bloated figure with hollow eyes. Eugenie, his likeness gathered, dust forgotten, and so did she. Winter came sharp and biting. The drafts in her room grew worse, the cold seeping into her bones. She coughed often, now a wet rattling sound that echoed off the stone walls. No physician came to tend to her. No one noticed at all. On the coldest night of the year, when the wind howled through the cracks in the mortar like a grieving spirit, Eugenia curled beneath her thin blanket and closed her eyes. Somewhere far away, the king laughed at some new amusement. Somewhere, a painter dipped his brush, ready to immortalize the next marvel. And somewhere in a forgotten corner of the palace, a girl who had once been a spectacle took her last shuddering breath. No one wept. No one even noticed. The next morning, a servant found her body. He crossed himself, muttered a quick prayer, and went to fetch the grave digger. Who was she? The grave digger asked as they wrapped her in a shroud. The servant shrugged. No one important. And with that, Eugenia Martínez. Vallejo was laid to rest in an unmarked grave. her name as fleeting as the whispers that had once surrounded her. The court moved on. The world did not pause to mourn, and history, ever cruel, prepared to forget her entirely. The painter came to her in the final days of winter, when the cold had settled deep into her lungs, and the light from the narrow window seemed too weak to warm even the dust motes in the air. He stood in the doorway, his easel tucked under one arm, his expression unreadable. "I've been sent to paint you," he said. Eugenia did not move from her cot. "Why?" The man hesitated, his fingers tightening around the wooden frame of the easel, the king's command. She let out a slow breath, watching it fog in the frigid air. Of course, even in her fading, she was still his spectacle. The painter set up his tools in silence, arranging his brushes and pigments with a precision that spoke of years of practice. Unlike Don Sebastian, this man did not snare or prod. He worked quietly, his gaze flitting between her and the canvas with something akin to not pity, but recognition. "You don't have to sit up," he said at last. "Just lie as you are." Eugenia closed her eyes. The weight of her body, once a source of grotesque fascination, had diminished. The flesh that had made her a marvel now clung loosely to her bones, the folds of skin slack with illness and neglect. The brushstrokes began soft and deliberate. The painter did not rush. "What is your name?" Eugenia asked, her voice a whisper. The brush stilled. "Luis." She opened her eyes. "Do you paint many monsters, Luis?" His gaze met hers. "Steady, I paint people." The words settled over her like a shroud for hours. The only sound was the scrape of bristles against canvas and the distant echo of footsteps in the corridor. Louis balked in silence, his hands moving with a gentleness that felt foreign in this place of cruelty. When the light began to fade, he set down his brush. "It's done." Eugenia did not ask to see it. She already knew what it would show: a woman broken by the weight of others. Laughter, her eyes hollow with sorrow, a final testament to a life reduced to spectacle. Luis packed his tools slowly, his movements deliberate. Before he left, he paused at the door. "They will remember you," he said quietly. Eugenia turned her face to the wall. "No, they will remember the monster they made of me." The door clicked shut behind him. Outside, the wind howled, and in the gathering dark, Eugenia Martínez Vallejo waited for the end. The portrait would hang in the Hall of Curiosities. One more oddity among many visitors would pause before, murmuring half-remembered rumors before moving on to the next wonder. But for now, in this quiet room, there was only the girl. Not a marvel, not a monster. Just a person. Finally unseen, and that perhaps was the greatest mercy of all. The portrait outlived her. It hung in the Hall of Curiosities for decades, gathering dust alongside the two-headed calf in formaldehyde, and the stuffed remains of a lion said to have been tamed by a saint. Visitors to the royal court would pause before the painting, their noses wrinkling at the grotesque figure depicted there. Who was she? A young noblewoman asked one afternoon, her silk skirts brushing the floor, as she leaned closer. Her companion, a man with a powdered wig and a perpetually bored expression, flicked open a fan. "Some peasant girl. I imagine the king kept her as a pet. Ayer fed her until she could barely walk." Quite the amusement in her day. The noblewoman tittered. How dreadful. "And they called this art a record of nature's follies," the man replied, staring her toward a more refined exhibit. A jeweled goblet said to have belonged to Solomon. The years rolled on. Wars were fought. Kings died. Empires rose and fell. The Hall of Curiosities was dismantled, its contents scattered to private collections and forgotten storerooms. Eugenie, as portraits changed hands half a dozen times, each owner less interested in the girl it depicted than in its value as a macabre conversation piece. In a dimly lit study in Madrid, a historian squinted at the painting, his spectacles perched on the tip of his nose. "Fascinating," he murmured to his assistant. A prime example of the Baroque fascination with the grotesque. Note the exaggerated proportions clearly meant to evoke both pity and revulsion. "Was she real?" the assistant asked, peering at the hollow-eyed figure. The historian shrugged. "If she was no one of consequence. A footnote in royal entertainment. At best." The painting was catalogued, labeled and tucked away in an archive. Eugenia Martínez Vallejo. The girl, who had once been a living spectacle, was now reduced to a line in an inventory portrait of an obese female subject artist, unknown circa 17th century. No name, no story, just a curiosity frozen in time. And yet, in the village of Braga, where the wind still carried the scent of dry grass and olive trees, an old woman knelt in the churchyard, anneled fingers, tracing a weathered stone. The inscription had long since faded, but she knew the words by heart. "Eugenia," she whispered. I remember the scullery maid, now white-haired and bent with age, placed a single wildflower on the unmarked grave. Somewhere beyond the reach of history's cruel erasure, a girl laughed in the sunlight. But the world had already turned the page. The cruelty of spectacle outlives its performers. Long after the laughter fades and the audience disperses, the echoes linger. Not in the halls where the jeers once rang, but in the way history folds itself around the forgotten centuries past. The Alcazar crumbled and was rebuilt. The faces of kings and queens dissolved into myth, and Eugenia Martínez Vallejo, the girl who had been called La Monstera, became a whisper in the archives, a grotesque footnote in the annals of royal amusement. Scholars debated her existence. Was she real or merely a fabrication? A cautionary tale about gluttony, a metaphor for excess. The few surviving portraits were studied not for the sorrow in her eyes, but for the brushstrokes that exaggerated her form. Art historians praise the masterful distortion, the play of light and shadow upon the grotesque. No one spoke of the girl beneath the paint in a university lecture hall. A professor projected an image of Eugenia as portrayed onto a screen. The students shifted in their seats, some stifling laughs, others wrinkling their noses in discomfort. This, the professor said, tapping the image with a pointer, exemplifies the Baroque obsession with the other. The fascination with bodies that deviated from the norm. Note how the artist dehumanizes the subject, rendering her as an object of ridicule rather than a person. A hand went up. Do we know what happened to her? The professor shrugged. Unclear. Most likely she died. Young people like her rarely survived long in that era. The discussion moved on. Elsewhere in a small town in Castile, a mother scolded her child for reaching for a second helping of dessert. "You'll end up like lemon straw," she chided, shaking her head. The legend had endured. Stripped of its humanity, reduced to a cautionary punchline. But in the quiet corners of the world, other stories persisted. A young artist stumbling upon Eugenia is portrayed in a forgotten corner of a museum. Felt her breath catch. The painting was small, shuffled between grander works, but the girl's eyes held her captive. There was something there, not just pain, but defiance. A silent scream across the centuries. The artist returned day after day, sketching Eugenia, his face in her notebook, trying to capture what the original painter had missed. The person behind the spectacle in a poetry slam in Madrid, a woman took the stage, a voice trembling with rage. They called her monster. But who carved that word into her skin? They fed her till she burst, then laughed as the scene split. Tell me which is the greatest in the room. Fallaci leant and in breakaway figure where the wind still carried the ghosts of old whispers. A group of schoolchildren gathered around a weathered plaque. Newly installed half by ivy, it bore a single name long erased from history, but now finally remembered. Eugenia Martínez Vallejo, 741690. She was a child. The legacy of a monster is not written by those who gawked or jeered. It is written in the quiet acts of remembrance. The artist who sees her humanity. The poet who gives her voice. The village that reclaims her name. The cruelty of spectacle is that it demands a victim. But the truth is this: Eugenia was never the monster. The monsters were the ones who made her one.